Everybody, and as the previous speaker has already mentioned, I would also like to thank the organisers very much for the invitation to speak at the ISFL Regional Conference. It's my very first time in this region, and I'm very pleased to be here. Although I do follow some of the developments in Israel from time to time, such as the Corporal Punishment in the home debate, which we have just kind of resolved in South Africa, sort of, a couple of months ago. I have a rather daunting topic to speak of. Firstly, quite a long period of time, 30 years, and then secondly, to speak of a very vast geographical area, namely a whole continent. And I've taken the approach that I'll first give some facts and figures that I think might be of interest, and then talk a little bit more about continental issues. Picking up on what my predecessor has said, look at some of the challenges which are probably all very well known to you, but bear repeating in the assessment of where we are after 30 years of the CRC. And I am looking at the convention in its most holistic scope, not just from the family law perspective, but also from the rights that are contained relating to health, relating to education, relating to child protection, Article 19, as well as juvenile justice to some extent. And then I will come to some more positive stories, and then I will conclude. So that is the introduction and structure. Just to contextualize, I served as a member of the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and the Welfare of the Child for 5 years, from 2011 to 2016. So I did in that capacity get a pretty good overview of the implementation of children's rights in countries outside of my own, sitting right at the south of the continent, South Africa. And I've also worked in many sub-Saharan African countries, including Namibia, Botswana, Kenya, South Sudan, Mozambique, Botswana, etc., etc. So I do have an idea of the implementation of the CRC in countries outside of my own as well. So starting with some facts and figures, Africa's child population will reach 1 billion by 2055, making it the largest child population amongst all of the continents. From 2017 onwards, which is already 2 years ago, Sub-Saharan Africa is the region with the highest number of births and no decline in population growth rates. And this trend will persist for the rest of the century. This is a justification for making it imperative to take Africa's children along the road of implementation of children's rights. Mortality rates among children under 5 decreased by 58% between 1990, the date on which the convention came into force, and 2017. And this can be largely ascribed, and I'll come back to this maybe if I remember, to the implementation of the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, which had as one of their indicators the reduction of infant and child mortality rates, which were achieved in a great many African countries by 2015. But still we have the problem that 5.4 million under 5 deaths in that year occurred in Africa, and these are largely preventable deaths. Child deaths tend to be concentrated at the youngest age group, with 85% of all deaths to children under 15 occurring amongst children younger than 5. And the preventable diseases that I refer to, pneumonia, malaria, and diarrhea, accounted for 36% of all under 5 deaths in Africa. So there's a long way to go towards implementing the rights contained in Article 24 of the CRC related to prevention of infant and child mortality. And on current trends, 31 million under 5 deaths will occur between 2018, last year already, and 2030. So as regards the implementation of health rights, the story is not yet over. As really regards education, this was another key goal of the Millennium Development Goals, was to achieve universal primary education. However, the assessment of the MDGs showed that although this was achieved in many African countries, it was achieved at the expense of quality education. There was what was called access shock, so classrooms with hundreds of children, unqualified teachers, so that the focus of the next development goals, the SDGs, has to be on quality education, which also depends on well-trained teachers. 11 million new teachers will be needed by 2030 to meet this best sub-regional performers pupil-teacher ratio. And then just a few other points that I threw in here because I thought that they might be interesting and relevant. Africa is the fastest growing population in the Muslim regions of the world. By 2060, 37% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa will be Muslim. Now note that I talk specifically here of sub-Saharan Africa because we know that the Muslim majority is evident in North Africa, in countries such as Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, and Tunisia. So I'm only talking about the population of sub-Saharan Africa. And it is estimated, although I couldn't find a recent figure for this comes from work that I did some years ago, that 40% of children in Africa grow up under Islam. And there are implications on this for children's rights, as I will show in 2 screens' time, notably the fact that there have been reservations entered into the CRC by some countries on the basis that they will not recognize rights that they regard as incompatible with Islam. And there's also a link between cultural practices and beliefs under Islam, although not exclusively so. So that's a very incompetent rendering of a map of Africa. Unfortunately, for some reason, my Adobe Acrobat license expired last week, and I had got no means of copying anything from Adobe Acrobat. So this is what we have, but it gives you a sense of the vastness of the continent and also the sense of regional specificities. I've just mentioned North Africa, in which the implementation of the CRC is very different, as well as the economic indicators, as is the case in, for instance, Central Africa, places like Central African Republic, Burundi, and Chad and Cameroon at the moment, which are mired in conflict. West Africa has its own set of dynamics. East Africa is growing from a point of view of economic development. And Southern Africa has various differing issues related to countries like Zambia, which is a highly indebted poor country, Zimbabwe, which is basically melted down completely, with all of the challenges that arise from that. Mention was made also, I think, of the stagnation, and I don't have a screen on this because it might get me into trouble, but one does have to look at political dynamics in the region. I was working last year with a certain Minister of Justice of a neighboring country who is now sitting in jail for corruption. This is not an unheard of story. He's actually a really nice guy. And I really thought he was going to implement my juvenile justice law really quickly, but now he's sitting in jail. He was arrested 2 weeks ago. The story of corruption is an ongoing one, which dilutes resources available for children, and as well as the story of mismanagement and incompetence in some quarters. Now, just to give an idea of the ratification status, Ghana was the very first country to ratify the CRC of all countries in the world in 1990. And sponsored and spurred on by UNICEF, there was universal African ratification quite quickly, with Somalia being the one exception, but Somalia has now ratified. I think it was in 2015. There are, as I mentioned, a lot of countries that have entered reservations. I've listed a few there: Algeria, Djibouti, Egypt, Mauritania. But when Somalia ratified and entered the same kind of reservation, that it would not apply provisions it felt to be against Islam. There were a number of countries that did not accept that reservation, which I think is significant. Now, recently all the things that the opening speaker, Judge Levy, mentioned were last year. This is this year. This year I worked on the publication Getting Girls Equal, which was launched on the 15th of November of this year. It is a report on the position of the girl in the law and policy in the whole of Africa, and I just put the cover on there for you. You can download it off the website of the African Child Policy Forum, ACPF, based in Addis Ababa. And I think it was a useful exercise to undertake to see how the position of the girl child has fared after 30 years. So some of the overall findings in this report, which covers a variety of domains, are firstly that great gains have been made in accessing primary education through the MDGs. But nevertheless, 23%, that's 1/4 almost, of all girls are out of school. And the dropout rate in secondary education is enormous. And primary education, useful though it is, doesn't get you to the next base, which is the ability to participate in the economy. The report also, drawing on other reports, notes the very high prevalence of sexual abuse in schools, as high as 83% in Botswana, 55% in Cameroon, and 50% in Rwanda. We know from the work done by organizations such as Girls Not Brides that 40% of girls in sub-Saharan Africa marry before the age of 18. Zambia, the figure is 42%, Malawi, it's 40%, and some countries it rises to 60 or 70%, like Niger. It has the highest adolescent pregnancy rates of 2018, which is also contributing to the huge growth of children. Children's numbers, for instance, 40% of children in Guinea are born to adolescents. There are some laws that discriminate directly against girls still in relation to inheritance, in relation to transmission of nationality, although the discrimination is more subtly evident in the actual indicators that one sees. So 1 in 10 girls misses school during menstruation, which means that 1 in 10 girls misses 20% of any given school year. Overall, girls are completely invisible in policy. We know that the CRC is, in its gender neutrality, does not highlight the situation of girls other than in relation to harmful cultural practices in Article 24. And the report also looks at intersectionality, the particularly vulnerable position of girls, not just as girls, but as girls in domestic work, girls in street situations, girls with a disability, girls as members of minority groups, etc., etc. Violence is another area that I think is a point of concern, as illustrated by the findings of the 2006 report of the Special Rapporteur on children against violence, and the subsequent work of Marta Santos Pius and her successor as Special Representative of the Secretary General. And there is increasingly documented data illustrating the prevalence of violence against children. So 33% of girls experience sexual violence before the age of 18 in Eswatini. If you don't know where Eswatini is, it's the new name the king gave to Swaziland. So you can just read for it, Swaziland. In Kenya, 2 million children are orphans. 1 in 3 girls have experienced sexual violence, and 73% of boys have experienced physical violence. Some communities in Kenya, 94% of girls have undergone FGM, or cutting. And then some more statistics there, and in the interest of time, I'll move on. Just one point about corporal punishment. The countries that have prohibited corporal punishment in all settings are provided for you on the screen, but that is not to say that corporal punishment doesn't actually occur in all settings, possibly outside of the judicial system, but certainly in schools, in homes, and in many other settings. And the point I always make is that in South Sudan, you don't smack your children, you just shoot them. So the banning of corporal punishment is in and of itself not nearly enough. Now, I've mentioned the role of armed conflict. 2016 was described by UNICEF as the worst year for children in Africa because of the outbreak of armed conflict in places. The African Committee of Experts commissioned a study, and this is taken from the press release of that study into armed conflict, focusing on North Africa, Libya, as you know, northern Kenya, where Al-Shabaab is operating, Nigeria, where Boko Haram is operating, and it does not make for pleasant reading as to the impact of armed conflict on children. And we're not only talking about children recruited into militias, but we're talking about children whose schools are burnt down, whose hospitals become unavailable, who lack access to healthcare and emergency services because of the armed conflict in their region. Harmful cultural practices. I want to just show you the following picture, which is it this picture, which I downloaded before my Adobe Acrobat license expired on Thursday. This is a picture of children being chained up. Now I need to go back. Okay, this was a picture of children being chained up in Senegal. The person who had effected this was a Quranic teacher. Children get sent to Quranic teachers in regions like West Africa to learn the Quran, but they actually get sent out onto the streets to beg. And then, as you can see, locked up, chained up. The person who did this was sentenced for 2 years imprisonment, as well as the blacksmith who made the chains. I wonder if I can go back. No. Thank you. Just to mention that this very issue was... Thank you. One more? This very issue was the subject matter of a communication to the African Committee of Experts against Senegal, the so-called Taliban case. And the committee has been having found against the government of Senegal for failing to address the issue of the children attending Quranic schools. The committee has been several times to Senegal to try and help government implement that decision, which was handed down in 2014. But obviously there are still many cases of this kind of abuse carrying on. Harmful cultural practices, this is taken from Girls Not Brides and indicates the prevalence of child marriage in the region. And as you can see, Africa stands quite high in the world, and there are many countries where child marriage is extremely prevalent, as I've already mentioned. I would like to reflect very quickly, because I think my time is expiring, on the role of HIV. HIV was from around 1996, when it was realized that HIV was not only an epidemic affecting gay men, but that it was also one that had profound implications for children, both adolescent children and also newborn children who were acquiring HIV through the birth process. This led to a huge volume of research, conferences, medical research, research on sexual and reproductive health behaviors, which I'm sure many of you are all aware with. And it had a profound effect for a while on children's rights as well. So there was talk of the orphan generation. There was an expansion of alternative care, so-called orphan industrial complex, on the basis that all children in Africa were AIDS orphans. And it had enormous consequences for children's rights. And I've mentioned the field of intercountry adoption. We know that there was a huge rise in intercountry adoption from African countries. Ethiopia became the hotspot. And there's also been enormous consequences for voluntourism, that is, people going to volunteer to work in orphanages to help all the little kids there. However, new infections and child deaths have greatly diminished due to robust clinical work in the primary healthcare sector, And I would argue that HIV is no longer the threat that it once was. But on the other hand, Olga has referred to vaccinations. There are other huge risks. For instance, Ebola, malaria, measles, and I heard a paper last week on Ebola that's broken out in the DRC, which has killed X number of tens of thousands of children, but at the same time has also destroyed the capacity of the government to deliver on inoculations. And so the number of deaths from measles are even higher because the children haven't been vaccinated. Migration has already been mentioned, in particular migration to Europe, but one must also bear in mind that there's significant migration of children from the east part of Africa to the Middle East. There is significant migration in West Africa, both north to Europe and also within West Africa. And then from Ethiopia and Somalia downwards, there's migration to South Africa. And at one stage before the European crisis, South Africa had the highest number of refugee and asylum seekers in the world, one little country. So this is both an opportunity as well as a threat. We know that children are migrating for economic opportunities. They are migrating independently by choice. And this is nothing new in the history of the world. And one must look at ways to support children's independent choices to move and see where they can make a better life for themselves elsewhere in the world. Okay, now I come to some better news. So, as has been pointed out, there's been significant law reform in almost every country in Africa, which has been based on the CRC and is rights-based. Mostly it is aimed at creating a child protection system of the kind that you would be familiar with, so how to respond to child abuse and neglect, how to deal with children in alternative care. And for the most part, there's also been juvenile justice reform, although this is slightly more sporadic. Sometimes it's in the same statute, other times it's a separate statute. There's also been significant sectoral and issue-based law reform in the areas of trafficking in persons, in the areas of gender-based violence, domestic violence, prohibition of harmful cultural practices. So one can't only go and look at the children's law or the child protection statute. We are seeing increasing constitutionalization of children's rights. I could talk for 2 hours about South Africa, which constitutionalized children's rights in 1996. But we have Zimbabwe 2013 with some key decisions on corporal punishment and child marriage. Kenya also constitutionalized children's rights in 2010. Tanzania, very recent decision on child marriage. And also Malawi, and there probably are other examples in languages that I can't read. The role of the African Child Policy Forum has been significant in trying to track the harmonization of laws in Africa with the CRC and other international treaties. So it's worthwhile visiting their website. The question of systems strengthening for child protection was the topic of the general comment number 5 of the African Committee of Experts. The system strengthening approach comes from basically Save the Children in an attempt to respond to the silo approaches where you have one organization dealing with street children and one organization dealing with trafficked children and another organization dealing with abused children, and actually they should all be pooling their efforts towards the same system. And it attempts to secure systems building from the bottom up, from the community level up, rather than having some office at the national level trying to sort out what's happening out there in the villages and in the townships. It's strongly linked to a movement that started in 2010 about social workforce strengthening, because without a social workforce, which you would know as social workers or community workers, actually there is no child protection system at all. When I started working in Mozambique, 2003, population of 17 million people, there were 4 social workers in the country. 4. That's for the disabled, the elderly, people with mental health issues, children, you name it, 4 social workers. You can't do anything with that. Child participation has been mentioned in Access to Justice, as well as my publication of last year for the African Child Policy forum on this precise issue. The publication covers all aspects of children's contact with justice systems, civil, criminal, and administrative, and it points to great improvements in, for instance, legal aid schemes for children in juvenile justice reform, in NGOs providing legal services to help children get their matters before court, strategic litigation, which is now taking off in the countries mentioned. So this is quite an encouraging story, although there's a long way to go. Specialized institutions have been developed in the 30 years of the CRC, for instance, dedicated children's courts, now more than 30 in Kenya, but in many cases they are limited to the capital city only. Dedicated specialized police units to respond to gender-based violence are also quite commonplace. I've given only 2 examples. And some places now have specialized forensic centers for data collection, for evidence collection in rape cases, so as to ensure more successful prosecutions. And the model is the Tutuzela centers in South Africa, which have also been rolled out in places like Zanzibar, Tanzania, and Malawi. There has been a huge decline in inter-country adoption from Africa, mainly due to moratoria from DRC, from Ethiopia, from Ghana. But as a paper I presented earlier this year attempts to show, there seems to be an increase in services offering international surrogacy. So that is also a place to watch in the future. And this is in the absence, with one exception, my own country, of any legal regulation of surrogacy at all. Very important are the cash transfer schemes that have been fostered by UNICEF, the World Bank, and DFID to reduce extreme poverty, and these clearly impact children in very positive ways, including access to education and to health. So this comes from the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, okay, rather than from the CRC itself, although, of course, the CRC does provide for children's rights to access social security. Other relevant treaties: slow ratification of the complaints mechanism, but widespread ratification of the African Children's Charter. I've mentioned the general comments of the African Committee of Experts. There's also widespread ratification of the ILO Worst Forms of Child Labour Convention and of the Paloma Protocol dealing with trafficking. There's a steady increase in ratifications of the Inter-Country Adoption Convention, but little take-up of the Abduction Convention. Very little take-up, and very little interest seemingly either. On the monitoring and enforcement level, there are any number of newish ministries and executive agencies, national committees for children. There's been good reporting to the CRC and the African Committee of Experts by African countries. There are now NHRIs, National Human Rights Institutions, in almost all countries with varying resources and capacity and independence, but no examples other than Mauritius of an ombudsman for children specifically. And then skip the second to last bullet, but the last bullet, very important, is the rise in importance of non-state actors, charities, international development agencies, and businesses and private sector agencies providing, for instance, private education and early childhood development facilities. Conclusions. See, I got there. Reconfiguration of the family. I know I'm speaking at the Family Law Conference. I venture to suggest that in many places, because of the very rapid urbanization that is occurring, and urban planners told me a couple of weeks ago that in some places it's at the rate of 100,000 to 300,000 new people per annum. And with that kind of rapid urbanization and the growth of megacities like Cairo and Nairobi and Dakar and those other Nigerian places that I don't like going to, there is obviously going to be a reconfiguration of the family and a demise to some extent of the kinship structures of old. In a conservative political climate, we are seeing a huge pushback on sexual and reproductive rights of adolescents. We have many examples now from Tanzania, where the president wants pregnant girls kicked out of school right now and has enacted legislation to ensure that that happens. It's not the only example. And that does not bode well for those facts I gave you right at the very beginning. The visibility of children has greatly increased via the incorporation of children's rights, and also through the work of aid organizations and through UNICEF and the legislation. However, children still lack the capacity or ability to pursue remedies by themselves in courts. Mostly they can only do this with the assistance of a parent or guardian ad litem. Customary law and pluralist legal systems remain highly, highly relevant, including even in urban areas where they are being re-established because of the inaccessibility of the formal justice system. Restorative justice had a huge landing and following in many African countries in the 1990s, but implementation seems to have waned and interest seems to have been lost to a large extent. And I refer here to restorative justice in the criminal law, juvenile justice context, but also in child protection and also in other areas that would interest you. So I conclude there have been some gains from 30 years of the CRC, but there's a long way to go. Thank you.